Good morning. Good morning to you all. And it's good to see you on this beautiful spring day. In this season of renewal and birth, it may seem odd to bring up this topic, but a while back there was a request to say something, to have some discussion about grief and loss from a Buddhist perspective. So I want to honor that request, and keeping in mind that grief and loss, death, are the other side of the coin of birth and renewal. So in a sense, they do go together. Now, often the story that is told when discussing grief in Buddhist circles is that of Kisagatami and the mustard seed. But and many of you may be familiar with that story. But I'm going to call upon a different story that is less familiar, but I think brings up another perspective. And that is the story of Patacara. Actually, her given name was Rupwati. Rupwati was born to a merchant family, a relatively wealthy merchant family in Savatthi, a commercial center in northern India at the time. And her name, as I understand it, means something like great beauty. And she grew up to be a attractive young woman. Subsequently, the family had a son, so she had a younger brother. And when Rupwati was coming of age, in the sense that they used the term at that time, the family made plans for her to become married to a somewhat older gentleman who was from another wealthy family, to sort of make a bond of alliance between the two families for commercial advantage. So the wedding was planned. But meanwhile, Rupwati had her own life to lead, and she had been very lonely in this house, even though she had been given many material advantages, fine clothes, etc. But she satisfied this loneliness by developing a friendship with one of the servants in the house. And that relationship became, as they say, intimate. And prior to the date of the planned wedding, she and the servant eloped to a small village a distance away from the family home. And they lived a simple life and enjoyed one another. And as one version of this story goes, eventually an embryo was conceived in her. And as the pregnancy progressed, she became concerned about having the baby, delivering the baby in this with very little support, with just her husband there and no women folk around. So she made plans to return to her home of birth, to her family, so that she could have the assistance that was available there. She knew that they would accept her no matter what she had done. But her husband wasn't so sure of acceptance. He was concerned that he might very well be punished or killed if he should return with her. So he kept putting off the trip and putting off the trip until she was approaching term and she realized that he just wasn't going to go. So she packed her things and went off on her own. When he realized what she was doing and that she was walking unprotected along these highways, which were not considered safe at the time for young women to be traveling on, he went off after her and went running and caught up with her on the highway. But about the time he was catching up with her, she was going into labor and she ended up delivering the baby there on the roadside. Once the baby had come, she and he sort of discussed this, and they decided, well, there wasn't really much benefit in her going home now. So she came back to the village where they lived and resumed their life with her new son. And as time passed, a couple years, 3 years went by, and once again, an embryo was conceived within her. And again, she was concerned, especially having, a small toddler to take care of and delivering another baby, that she just needed the assistance of the women at her home of birth, at her parents' house. So again, she and her husband discussed this, and the same sort of thing happened. And eventually, as she approached the time of delivery, she realized her husband wasn't going to come with her. She went off down the road on her own, carrying her with her son. And once again, he realized that what she was doing and went running off after her. But about the time that he caught up with her, a great storm was brewing, and the winds were whipping up, and there was rain clouds, and it really looked like a violent storm. And she asked her husband to do something to make shelter for them there. So he went off and was gathering branches and grasses to form some sort of shelter. But in the tall grass, there was a black snake that bit him, and he died instantly. So this was about nightfall, and he didn't come back, and she wondered what was going on, and she went through a night, worrying about him and whether she had been abandoned by him or what was going on. She didn't know, and at daybreak, she went off fervently looking for him and trying to find her husband, and did find him, found his body there in the tall grass. And she was inconsolate. She was tearful, and as you can imagine. But she decided that especially now it was important for her to get back to her family home. So she took the child, now about 3 years old, and went off toward her home. But the river that they had crossed in order to get to the village previously was now a turbulent, torrent of water because of the storm that had come up during the night. And she didn't think that she could cross the river safely with both children. So she formed a plan to leave the older child on the near bank and carry the baby, who had subsequently delivered there by the roadside, she carried the baby across the river, the river that with the rapid flow of water. And she succeeded in doing that and laid the baby down on a palm leaf on the opposite shore, and was going to go back across the river to get the other child to bring him across. But when she got halfway across the river, she noticed in the sky a hawk that came down and grabbed the baby and took it away. And she was waving her arms and yelling and trying to scare the hawk and make the hawk drop the baby, but it all to no avail. But as she was waving her arms and yelling, the child on the near bank, the 3-year-old, seeing her, thought that she was motioning him to get in the water and come across. So he did. He entered the river and was quickly taken up by the rapid current and drowned. Well, of course, she was devastated. She went to the far side of the river and sobbed and sobbed for hours. And then she realized that she just had to get home. This was horrible. So she was on her way back to her town where she had been born, where she had grown up, where her parents were. And she saw one of the townspeople on the road, and she asked about her parents and how things were going. And he said, oh gosh, I hate to tell you this, but with that storm last night, their house collapsed and none of them survived, your brother and parents. In fact, you can look in the distance and see the smoke from the pyre where they're being cremated. At first, she couldn't believe what she heard, and then, it sank in that this person was telling her the truth. She went back to her home and sure enough, it was totally collapsed. There was nothing left there. And she, just at that point, literally lost her mind, screaming, crying, tearing her clothes, so that she ended up just walking around through the town, half naked, sobbing, wandering aimlessly, which was a pattern that she continued for days and days and days. And eventually the townspeople either just ignored her or said abusive things to her. They gave her the name Patacara, which was cloak wanderer. And she continued in this manner, walking around unwashed, stringy hair, half naked, torn clothing. And one day, the Buddha and his entourage were in the area, and the Buddha was giving a talk. And she stopped and looked and stood there in the back of the crowd, and the Buddha noticed her. And in one version of this story, it goes like this: the Buddha, having suffused her with a suffusion of loving kindness, said, "Regain your mindfulness, sister. Regain your mindfulness, sister." Having heard the Buddha's words, she regained a strong sense of modesty and shame, and she sat down on the ground right there. A gentleman who was standing not far away threw her an upper robe. She dressed herself and listened to the talk, and the Buddha, on her account, spoke this verse. Not in children is there refuge, not in father or in kin. For one attacked by the end maker, there is no refuge in relatives. Having understood the consequence, the wise one who protects his virtue quickly purifies the path that leads to nibbana. Well, at the conclusion of that, she took the robe that she had and requested to be a nun. And she became a nun. And she actually became one of the leaders of the nuns and a teacher of nuns for the rest of her life. And one day, a couple years later, several years later, when she was a nun, she was outside washing her feet. And as it goes, one day she took water in her water pot and pouring it while washing her feet, it went but a little way and stopped. She poured it a second time and it went a little farther. She poured it a third time and it went even farther than that. Having taken that as a meditation object and defining the 3 ages of life, she thought, like the first pouring of the water by me, some of these beings die in the first age of life. And those who go further than that, like the second time I poured out the water, die in the middle age. And those who go farther than that, like the third time I poured out the water, surely die in the last age of life. And then she had a vision of the Buddha appearing before her as if he were face to face and saying, he who lives for 100 years not seeing rise and fall is surpassed by one living for 1 day, fully seeing rise and fall. And at that point, she was awakened. So there are a number of versions of this story. I would like to read just a second version of the conclusion of the story that appears in a book called Women of the Way by Sally Tisdale. And this is when she had come to the gathering of the monks and the Buddha as he was starting his talk. And Sally Tisdale refers to the Buddha as Siddhartha. Siddhartha saw her in the water, and he knew she must be close to being whole. You have to be broken in order to be fixed. And she was completely broken. There was no more of that work to do. She had nothing to let go of, having already let go of everything. So he followed her with his disciples trailing behind, complaining. His disciples were complaining, leave that lunatic alone. Don't get close to her. He said, don't avoid her. He went up to her and he touched her shoulder and said, sister, recover your presence of mind. Just like that, she was brought back to clarity. She looked around in a daze at the man beside her, the frowning men watching her, the city walls, the water. Seeing that she was dirty and undressed, she fell ashamed to the ground, trying to cover herself. A monk finally took pity on her and gave her his outer robe. Patacara wrapped it around herself and then knelt at Siddhartha's feet, crying out the story of her loss. She had suddenly remembered everything as a wounded man remembers when the anesthetic wears off. Help me, she begged, save me from this pain. The Buddha answered, I can't help you with this. Nothing can save us from loss and grief. Family doesn't last. Kin doesn't last, not in this world or the next. You're clutching at something that you can't keep, that you could never have kept. He smiled then, and it was so unexpected, so pure, that she stopped crying. He helped her to stand. This isn't the first time you've mourned children. An ocean of tears, he said, has been shed. An ocean waits to be shed. This is the cycle. No other being can shelter or protect us. But there is a path, a way out of pain. It's better to know the truth about the world for a single day than to live 100 years without it. Patacara, he said, by the time he finished speaking, lightly, gently, almost in a whisper, she had become a once returner, a person who needs only one more rebirth to realize enlightenment. So I'm sure there are aspects of that story that are apocryphal and some that are perhaps historical, but it doesn't really matter. The story has rung true and been passed on for centuries. One thing that strikes me about that story, and I'll just mention this, is that in both versions, the change in Patacara at the end is preceded by the compassion of the Buddha, is preceded by being suffused with loving kindness, being offered love. And without that, really, she couldn't hear the message. So that was an essential ingredient for her transformation. And when she first heard the Buddha's words, she was hearing them on one level as words, as what the Buddha was saying. But it took a matter of years for her to understand them on another level through a physical event, pouring the water on the ground and seeing it soak into the earth. And then she understood on a deeper level the truth of arising and ceasing, of coming and going, and of birth and death. So I think that's one perspective on the view of the Buddha about grief. And there are other stories too that could be discussed, but I think I'll stop there. I would be interested in what struck you about that story. What details caught your attention? Whether you find it a helpful story, a credible story on an emotional level, what do you think about it? And how does it offer any instruction about grief and loss? So we'll stop there and go into groups, breakout rooms, and join together in a few minutes.